Between May 7th and 16th, 1974, 11 law enforcement officers were eliminated across Pike County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Thompson Vendetta. All adults, all members of the same sheriff's department. The method was surgical: hunting rifles from distance, ambushes on mountain roads, executions carried out with military precision. The perpetrators weren't a criminal organization or domestic terrorists. They were 4 brothers from the Thompson family, moving through the Cumberland Mountains like ghosts, methodically erasing every man who'd been present the night their father died. The FBI would later call it the most calculated assault on law enforcement in Appalachian history, but the motive wasn't anti-government ideology, wasn't a drug war, wasn't even a blood feud passed down through generations. It was a father's death during a raid the brothers believed was murder disguised as duty, and 4 sons who valued their father's honor more than their own freedom or lives. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Pike County, Kentucky, sprawled across 789 square miles of some of the most isolated terrain in the eastern United States in 1974. The Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient barriers, their peaks reaching over 4,000 feet, their valleys so narrow and deep that sunlight only touched the bottom for a few hours each day. Population stood around 68,000, down from 85,000 in the boom years of the 50s when coal was king. The county seat, Pikeville, held barely 6,000 souls who knew each other's business, each other's secrets, and each other's grudges going back decades. May in Pike County meant temperatures dropping to the low 50s at night, creeping up to maybe 75 by mid-afternoon if you were lucky. The air smelled like coal smoke from heating stoves still running in the mornings, mixed with the sweet rot of wild honeysuckle blooming along roadside ditches and the sharp scent of creek water running cold over limestone. At night, when fog rolled down from the ridges, you could hear whippoorwills calling across the hollows, and the distant sound of coal trains moving through cuts blasted from solid rock a century before. Sound traveled strange in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a diesel engine 2 miles away, clear as a bell. Other times you wouldn't hear a man walking 10 feet behind you until his boot snapped a branch. But 1974 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The mining industry that had sustained Pike County for nearly a century was in freefall. Mines that had employed thousands now sat abandoned, their entrances sealed with concrete, their machinery rusting in the rain. Unemployment hovered around 38%. Men who'd spent their entire adult lives underground, breathing coal dust, risking their lives for union wages, now had nothing. No jobs, no prospects, no way to feed their families except disability checks that barely covered rent and food stamps that bought humiliation at the checkout counter. In that economic wasteland, some families turned to marijuana cultivation. The mountains provided everything needed: hidden hollows where law enforcement rarely ventured, rich soil in the creek bottoms, and a network of logging roads known only to locals. But the business required protection. That's where Sheriff Clayton Wade came in. The Thompson homestead sat 12 miles northeast of Pikeville, up Route 119 past the Shelby Creek turnoff, then 3 miles on a gravel road that turned to mud when it rained and ice when winter came early. 47 acres of bottom land and hillside that had been in the Thompson family since 1891, when Michael Thompson's great-grandfather bought it with savings from 10 years working underground. The property wasn't worth much by modern standards. Maybe $15,000 total. No mineral rights. Those had been sold off in 1923 during hard times. Just a white farmhouse built in 1937, a tobacco barn with a rusted tin roof, and fields that grew mostly rocks and stubbornness. But to Robert James Thompson, those 47 acres represented everything: legacy, independence, the only inheritance he could pass to his 4 sons in a world that had taken everything else from mountain families like his. Most folks in Pike County had never been farther than Lexington, 150 miles west. The nearest real city, Charleston, West Virginia, sat 90 miles north, on roads that could kill you if you weren't careful. Robert James Thompson was 58 years old that May, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet even, but stooped forward from 3 decades spent hunched in coal seams barely 4 feet high. His hands were huge, knuckles swollen with arthritis, fingers permanently stained black from coal dust that no amount of scrubbing could remove. A thick scar ran from his right ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a roof collapse in 1962 that killed 3 men standing right beside him. He walked with a pronounced limp, legacy of the same accident, and when the weather turned cold, that limp became so severe his youngest son had to help him up the porch steps. Every morning, Robert woke at 5:30, made coffee in a percolator, so old the bottom was worn thin, and sat at his kitchen table, reading from a King James Bible his mother had given him in 1934. He'd read 1 chapter, drink his coffee black and strong enough to strip paint, then step outside to watch the sun come up over Pine Mountain. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Pall Mall rolled so tight it lasted 15 minutes, and then he'd start his day. Check the tobacco plants in the bottom field, mend fence along the property line, split firewood for next winter because you always stayed a year ahead in the mountains. Fix whatever had broken the day before, and there was always something broken. He'd married Martha Louise Adkins in 1949, right after his discharge from the Army. They'd had 4 sons. Michael was 29 now, back from Vietnam with nightmares he never talked about. David was 27, quieter than his older brother, but just as capable. James was 24, the thinker of the family, always reading, always questioning. Thomas was 22, the youngest, still trying to figure out who he was beyond being Robert Thompson's son. Martha was 56 now, a thin woman whose face had been worn smooth by worry, like a river stone polished by decades of current. She'd buried both her parents in mining accidents, watched the town she grew up in slowly die, and now lived with the knowledge that her husband's lungs were so scarred from coal dust that every breath sounded like sandpaper on wood. What Robert valued most wasn't money, though God knew they needed it with 4 grown sons and no steady income beyond his black lung disability checks. What he valued was the idea that a man could still own something outright in this world. No bank loans, no corporate bosses, no government telling you what you could do with your own land. His great-grandfather had bought this land free and clear. His grandfather had died defending it from coal company lawyers who wanted to strip mine the hillsides. His father had held on to it through the Depression when neighbors were losing everything to bankruptcy. Robert saw it as inheritance, tradition, and survival, all rolled into the smell of tobacco curing in the barn and the feel of soil that had grown crops for 4 generations. The land itself wasn't particularly good, too steep for modern farming, too rocky for cattle, too isolated for development, but it was theirs, paid for with blood and sweat and broken backs. And Robert Thompson would rather die than see it taken or used for purposes he couldn't abide. He'd taught his sons that some things mattered more than money. Your name mattered. Your word mattered. Your ability to look yourself in the mirror mattered. And the land your ancestors bled for, that mattered most of all. Michael Andrew Thompson was 29 years old that May, though people who knew him said he looked older, aged by 3 tours in Vietnam that had taken something essential and replaced it with something harder. He stood 6'2" with a lean, ropey build that came from manual labor rather than gym time. His most distinctive feature was a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a souvenir from shrapnel that had caught him wrong during the Tet Offensive in '68. The scar gave him a permanent look of skepticism, like he was always questioning whatever you were saying. David Robert Thompson was 27, built thicker than his older brother, 5'11" but solid through the chest and shoulders from years unloading lumber at the sawmill before it closed. Where Michael was intense and focused, David was steady, methodical, the kind of man who thought 3 steps ahead and never showed his hand. James Thomas Thompson was 24, the intellectual of the family, though he'd never finished college after 2 semesters at Pikeville Community. He stood 6'1", lean like Michael, with hands that looked too delicate for mountain work, but could field strip a rifle in 30 seconds flat. Thomas Ray Thompson, 22 years old, was the youngest and in many ways the most conflicted. He'd tried to join the Marines in '72, but got rejected for a heart murmur. The doctors said was insignificant, but the military said was disqualifying. All four brothers had learned to shoot before they turned 10. Their father had taught them using the same Remington 700 rifle his own father had used, teaching them to account for wind, distance, and the way a bullet drops over range. In the mountains, shooting wasn't a hobby. It was survival. Deer hunting put meat on the table when money was tight. Squirrels and rabbits filled the gaps. And every Thompson man knew that accuracy mattered because ammunition cost money they didn't have to waste. Michael had served as a designated marksman in Vietnam. David had qualified expert with the M14 during his 2 years in Germany. James had won the Pike County shooting competition 3 years running before the prize money dried up and they stopped holding it. Thomas, despite his rejection from military service, could hit a tin can at 300 yards with iron sights. What bound the four brothers together wasn't just blood. It was a code their father had taught them from childhood. Family comes first, always. Never let anyone make you look weak. Never back down from a righteous fight. And never, ever let someone take what's yours without consequences. Their father had left them almost nothing in terms of material wealth. No savings account, no life insurance policy, no college funds. Just those 47 acres and the knowledge that 4 generations of Thompson men had held onto that land through wars, depressions, and economic catastrophes that would come again. By May of 1974, all 4 brothers were living within 5 miles of the homestead. Michael had a small trailer up Salt Lick Hollow. David rented a house in Shelby Creek. James lived in a converted garage apartment behind the Pikeville Motor Lodge, where he worked nights as a desk clerk. Thomas still had a room in the family house, sleeping in the same bed he'd had since childhood. None of them had steady work. The mines were closing. The sawmill had shut down. The few jobs available went to men with connections, or men willing to work for wages that wouldn't feed a family. They survived on odd jobs, disability checks, food stamps, and the unspoken understanding that being poor in Appalachia wasn't a personal failure. It was a systemic betrayal of people who'd literally built America's industrial power with their bodies and received nothing but broken promises in return. What Robert Thompson valued most, and what he'd passed to his sons, wasn't just the land. It was the principle that some things couldn't be bought or sold or compromised. Your integrity was one. Your family's name was another. And the land your great-grandfather had bought with 10 years of his life spent underground in darkness, that was sacred. That land represented everything the Thompson family had ever been or would ever be. 47 acres that weren't worth fighting for by any rational calculation. But rationality had nothing to do with it. This was about identity, about continuity, about being able to stand on soil your ancestors had stood on, and know that you'd held the line, that you hadn't been the generation that let it all slip away. Robert had promised his father on his deathbed in 1957 that the land would stay in the family, and he'd raised 4 sons to understand that some promises mattered more than life itself. Clayton Marcus Wade was 52 years old that spring, though he carried himself like a man who'd never aged past the confidence of 30. He stood 5'10", built thick through the middle from years of sitting behind desks and eating free meals at every diner in Pike County. His face was florid, permanently red from high blood pressure and whiskey, with jowls that hung heavy over the collar of shirts that cost more than most county residents made in a week. He wore his brown hair slicked back with pomade, kept a diamond ring on his right pinky finger, and drove a 1973 Cadillac Eldorado that everyone knew he couldn't afford on a sheriff's salary. But nobody asked questions. Not in Pike County, not if they wanted to keep living there peacefully. Clayton Wade had been sheriff for 24 years, first elected in 1950 at age 28, on promises to clean up corruption left over from the old coal company enforcers. The irony wasn't lost on people who remembered. He'd become exactly what he'd campaigned against, just more sophisticated about it. Every morning, Wade arrived at the Pike County Sheriff's Office at 9:30, never earlier, sometimes later. He'd drink coffee from a silver thermos his wife filled with bourbon-laced brew, read the Appalachian News Express, and hold court like a feudal lord receiving petitions. People came to him for favors. Speeding tickets fixed, property disputes settled quietly, jobs for relatives, and Wade dispensed these favors with the understanding that everything had a price. Everything created obligation, and obligation was the currency that bought real power in a poor county. His office sat on the second floor of the Pike County Courthouse, a limestone building constructed in 1937 with WPA money. From his window, Wade could see most of downtown Pikeville, the coal company offices, mostly empty now, the First National Bank where he kept 3 accounts under different names, the law offices of attorneys who knew better than to dig too deep into county business. His deputies weren't law enforcement in any traditional sense. They were a protection racket with badges. 8 men, all related to Wade by blood or marriage, all pulling county salaries while spending most of their time collecting payoffs from the marijuana operations that had sprung up in the mountains after the mines closed. The arrangement was simple. Growers paid Wade $500 per month per acre under cultivation. In return, Wade's department looked the other way. If state police came sniffing around, Wade got advance warning through contacts in Frankfurt and passed it along. If federal agents showed up, which was rare, Wade had enough legitimate drug busts staged and ready to show he was doing his job. The system worked because everyone who mattered got paid. Growers made money. Wade made money. His deputies made money. And the county commissioners who appointed Wade election after election got campaign contributions that kept them in office. The only people who didn't benefit were ordinary residents who watched their county become a narcotics corridor, while the sheriff drove a Cadillac and built a 6,000-square-foot house on Lake Cumberland. By 1974, Wade's operation had expanded to protection of 17 different growing operations scattered across Pike County's 789 square miles. The math was simple. 17 operations averaging 20 acres each at $500 per acre per month equaled $170,000 annually. Wade took 60% off the top. His chief deputy, Carl Mason, his brother-in-law, took 15%. The remaining 7 deputies split the rest. Nobody kept records. Everything was cash. And anyone who objected found themselves facing sudden legal problems. Warrants for old offenses, property seized for unpaid taxes, anonymous tips to state police about unrelated crimes. Wade had perfected the art of pressure without leaving fingerprints. The growers themselves were mostly local men desperate for income after the mines closed. They weren't criminals by nature, weren't cartel members or organized gangsters. They were laid-off coal miners, unemployed sawmill workers, men who'd grown up in these hollows and knew every hidden creek bottom where marijuana plants could grow undetected from the air. The product wasn't sophisticated. No hydroponics, no genetic engineering, just seeds planted in rich bottom land, tended through summer, and harvested in fall. Quality was inconsistent. Yields varied wildly, but demand from colleges in Lexington and Cincinnati remained steady, and the prices made it worth the risk. A good harvest from 5 acres could bring $20,000. More money than a man could make in 3 years of legitimate work, if legitimate work even existed. Wade's genius was recognizing that rural poverty created opportunity for anyone willing to provide infrastructure. The growers had no way to transport products safely or find buyers willing to pay fair prices. Wade's network solved both problems. His deputies drove county vehicles that never got stopped or searched. His contacts in Lexington and Charleston moved product to distributors who paid cash. His system turned amateur farmers into reliable suppliers, and everybody prospered, except the people who said no. The Thompson property had been on Wade's acquisition list since 1972. 47 acres, 12 miles from town, 3 miles up a gravel road that saw maybe one vehicle per day besides the family. Perfect isolation, good soil along Shelby Creek bottomland, and a tree line thick enough to hide plants from aerial surveillance that was becoming more common as the feds started taking rural marijuana seriously. Wade had approached Robert Thompson twice before. First time in December of '72, friendly conversation at the hardware store, just testing the waters. Robert had declined politely but firmly. No interest in leasing land for agriculture or any other purpose. Second time in June of '73, Wade sent Carl Mason to make a formal offer. $3,000 annual lease for 20 acres. No questions asked about what got planted. Robert had told Mason to get off his property and not come back. Wade wasn't used to being refused. In Pike County, when the sheriff wanted something, people found ways to accommodate him. But Robert Thompson was old-school mountain stubborn, the kind of man who'd rather eat beans for a year than compromise on principle. On April 18, 1974, a Thursday afternoon when temperatures hit 78 degrees and the dogwoods were blooming white against the green mountainsides, Deputy Eugene Tackett drove out to the Thompson homestead. Tackett was 34, built solid, with a thick mustache and eyes that never quite met yours when he talked. He found Robert working in the tobacco field, preparing beds for transplanting seedlings that sat in the greenhouse Robert had built from salvaged windows and 2x4s. Tackett didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sheriff Wade was prepared to offer $15,000 cash for a 5-year lease on 20 acres. That was 3 times the previous offer. More money than Robert would see from tobacco farming in a decade. The only condition was Robert and his family couldn't visit or work the lease section during growing season, April through October. Robert had leaned on his hoe, looked at Tackett for a long moment, and said exactly 4 words, "Get off my land." Tackett had tried reason, tried explaining that times were hard, that $15,000 could set Robert up comfortable, that plenty of other families in Pike County had made similar arrangements and nobody got hurt. Robert's response was to walk to the house, retrieve his Remington 700, and stand on the porch with the rifle cradled across his chest, not pointing it at anyone, not making threats, just making his position unmistakably clear. Tackett had left, but on his way down the gravel road, he'd stopped his cruiser, gotten out, and carved 3 X marks into the bark of an old oak tree that stood at the property entrance. Mountain code everyone understood. 3 marks meant a death warning. Robert Thompson had seen those marks the next time he drove to town. He'd said nothing to his wife, nothing to his sons, just filed it away as confirmation of what he'd always believed. When powerful men wanted something and you had the spine to refuse them, they'd find a way to take it anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, small things started happening. Robert's mailbox got knocked down 3 times. Someone cut his telephone line twice. A tire on his truck developed a slow leak from a nail that looked deliberately placed. None of it was actionable. All of it was message. Then on May 3rd, a Friday evening just after dark, someone fired 3 shots from the road toward the house. High shots, over the roof, meant to intimidate rather than kill. Martha had been terrified. Robert had called the sheriff's office to report it. The dispatcher had taken the information and promised someone would come take a report. Nobody ever came. Robert Thompson understood then that he was alone. The law wouldn't protect him because the law wanted his land. His neighbors wouldn't help because they were either scared of Wade or already on his payroll, and refusing to cooperate with the sheriff's enterprise had marked him as a problem requiring elimination. What Robert didn't know was that on May 6th, Sheriff Wade had held a meeting with his 8 deputies at his home on Lake Cumberland, 90 miles from Pikeville, where county residents wouldn't see county vehicles parked together for hours. Wade had explained the situation. Robert Thompson was refusing a generous offer and making the department look weak. Other growers were watching. If one old man could tell the sheriff no and get away with it, the whole protection system started to crumble. Something had to be done. The solution Wade proposed was elegant in its simplicity. They'd received an anonymous tip about illegal weapons at the Thompson property. Given Robert's age and known stubbornness, there was risk he might resist a lawful search warrant. If things went sideways, if Robert made any threatening moves, deputies were authorized to use necessary force to protect themselves. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Every deputy understood exactly what Wade was ordering, without him having to say it explicitly. At 3:47 in the morning on May 7th, 1974, 8 Pike County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Thompson homestead in 4 unmarked vehicles. No lights, no sirens, no warning. They'd parked at the bottom of the gravel road and walked the last quarter mile to avoid alerting the family. The night was cool, temperature around 52 degrees, with fog thick enough that visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. Perfect conditions for what they'd planned. Martha Thompson woke first, hearing boots on the porch. She'd shaken Robert awake. He'd gotten out of bed, pulled on his pants, and was walking toward the front door when it exploded inward from a battering ram. 8 men poured into the house, shouting commands. Get down. Get on the floor. Search warrant. Don't move. Robert had frozen in the hallway, hands visible, making no threatening gestures, but in the chaos and darkness, with adrenaline running high and deputies who'd been told to expect resistance, what happened next had the inevitability of tragedy. Deputy Eugene Tackett later claimed he saw Robert reach toward the gun cabinet in the living room. Deputy Carl Mason later claimed he saw a weapon in Robert's hand. Deputy Frank Mullins later claimed he heard Robert threaten to shoot. None of it was true. Martha Thompson, who watched everything from the bedroom doorway, would testify that her husband never moved toward any weapon, never made any threat, never did anything except stand in his own hallway looking confused and frightened while 8 armed men invaded his home. 7 shots were fired in the span of maybe 4 seconds. 3 from Carl Mason's service revolver, 2 from Eugene Tackett's, 1 each from Frank Mullins and Deputy James Rowland. 5 of the 7 bullets struck Robert Thompson, 2 in the chest, 1 in the abdomen, 1 in the left shoulder, 1 in the neck. He was dead before he hit the floor at 3:51 in the morning, 4 minutes after the deputies breached his door. The search that followed was thorough and fruitless. Deputies tore apart every room, every closet, every cabinet. They found Robert's hunting rifles, all legal and properly stored in a locked cabinet. They found a .22 pistol that had belonged to his father, also legal. They found 2 shotguns, both registered, no illegal weapons, no drugs, no evidence of anything except a law-abiding citizen who'd been executed in his own home. By 4:30 in the morning, the deputies had called the state police barracks in Harlan County to report an officer-involved shooting. By 5:15, a Kentucky State Police investigator named Captain James Morrison had arrived to find Robert Thompson's body covered with a sheet. Martha Thompson in shock, being attended by a neighbor woman someone had called, and 8 deputies whose stories were already coordinated down to the smallest detail. Morrison was 53 years old, 28 years on the force, and he'd investigated enough shootings to know when something didn't smell right. The entry wound patterns suggested Robert had been standing still, not reaching for anything. The bullet trajectories indicated he'd been shot from multiple angles simultaneously, which didn't match a scenario where he was threatening officers, and the complete absence of any weapon near the body raised obvious questions. But Morrison also understood the reality of investigating a sheriff's department in rural Kentucky. The deputies would back each other's stories. The sheriff had political connections that reached to Frankfort, and any investigator who pushed too hard would find himself transferred to a less desirable posting or suddenly facing budget cuts that made his job impossible. Morrison did his job. He documented the scene, photographed the body, collected the shell casings, and took statements from all 8 deputies. Then he wrote a preliminary report that concluded the shooting appeared consistent with deputies' accounts of a subject making threatening gestures during execution of a lawful search warrant. pending final autopsy results and further investigation. The autopsy was performed on May 8th at the State Medical Examiner's Office in Frankfurt. Dr. William Patterson, who'd conducted over 3,000 autopsies in his career, found that Robert Thompson had been struck by 5 bullets, none of them immediately fatal, except the neck wound that severed his carotid artery. Time of death was estimated at 3:51 in the morning. Toxicology showed no drugs or alcohol in his system. The report noted that wound patterns suggested the victim had been standing still when shot, arms at his sides, no defensive wounds on his hands or arms. Patterson noted in his findings that the shooting pattern was inconsistent with the subject actively threatening officers, but he stopped short of calling it an execution. Medical examiners who wanted to keep their jobs learned not to directly contradict law enforcement narratives unless evidence was absolutely overwhelming. The official determination was death by multiple gunshot wounds sustained during law enforcement action, justified use of force pending further investigation. That investigation would take 6 months and conclude exactly what Sheriff Wade needed it to conclude. The Thompson brothers learned of their father's death at 6:30 in the morning when a state police officer knocked on Michael's trailer door. Michael had driven immediately to the homestead, arriving to find his mother sedated, his father's body already removed by the coroner, and a crime scene that had been cleaned and processed before any family member could see it. David arrived 20 minutes later, James and Thomas within the hour. By 8 in the morning, all 4 brothers stood in the front hallway where their father had died, looking at blood stains that deputies hadn't bothered to clean. Nobody spoke for a long time. What was there to say? Their father was dead, killed by the same sheriff's department that was supposed to protect county residents, killed in his own home for the crime of refusing to let his land be used for purposes he couldn't abide. And every institution that should have provided justice, the state police, the prosecutor's office, the courts, was already moving toward the predetermined conclusion that this was a tragic but justified shooting. Robert James Thompson was buried on May 10th, 1974, a Friday afternoon when temperatures reached 82 degrees and the sky was so blue it looked painted. The service was held at Shelby Creek Baptist Church, the same church where he'd been baptized in 1924, where he'd married Martha in 49, where he'd brought his 4 sons every Sunday until they were old enough to make their own choices about faith. Reverend Samuel Potter, 71 years old and half blind, delivered a eulogy that carefully avoided mentioning how Robert had died. He spoke of a good man, a hard worker, a devoted husband and father. He quoted scripture about the meek inheriting the earth and the righteous finding peace in heaven. He did not mention that Robert Thompson had been executed by corrupt lawmen in his own hallway. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud in Pike County, even in church. The funeral was attended by maybe 40 people, neighbors who'd known Robert for decades, a few distant cousins from over in Letcher County, some men Robert had worked with in the mines before his back gave out and black lung made breathing an hourly struggle. Sheriff Clayton Wade did not attend. Neither did any of his deputies. Their absence was noticed by everyone and commented on by no one. In the mountains, you learned early that some observations were safer left unspoken. The cemetery sat on a hillside overlooking Shelby Creek, a small plot where Thompson family members had been buried since the 1890s. Robert's grandfather was there, died in 1941. His father died in 57. 2 infant siblings who hadn't survived childhood, their tiny headstones worn smooth by decades of rain. The grave had been dug by hand the day before, 6 feet deep in rocky soil that fought every shovel thrust. Michael, David, James, and Thomas had done the digging themselves, refusing offers of help, working in silence as the spring sun beat down and sweat soaked through their shirts. Digging their father's grave was the last physical act of service they could provide, and they'd wanted no one else involved. The burial itself took 11 minutes. Reverend Potter read from Psalms. Martha Thompson stood supported by her sister, too sedated to cry, staring at the coffin like she couldn't quite understand what it contained. The four brothers stood in a line, shoulder to shoulder, dressed in the only suits they owned, purchased years ago for job interviews that never led anywhere. None of them cried. Mountain men didn't cry at funerals, especially not when the death demanded response rather than mourning. After the coffin was lowered and the first shovelfuls of dirt had been thrown, most attendees drifted away. By 4:30 in the afternoon, only the four brothers remained. They stood at their father's grave, while shadows lengthened across the hillside and the temperature dropped and birds called from the tree line 50 yards away. Nobody spoke for the longest time. What needed to be said existed beyond language, in the code their father had taught them, in the understanding that some wrongs couldn't be forgiven or forgotten or left to a justice system that had already demonstrated its corruption. Finally, Michael, the oldest, spoke 4 words. "They're all going to die." David nodded once. James said nothing, but his silence was agreement. Thomas, the youngest, who'd spent the past 3 days crying when his brothers couldn't see him, wiped his eyes and said the only thing that mattered. "When do we start?" The decision had been made without discussion, without debate, without any consideration of alternatives. Mountain justice for mountain wrongs. The legal system had failed. The institutions designed to protect citizens had instead murdered one. And 4 sons who'd been raised to believe that honor meant something were about to become exactly what their father would never have wanted them to be. Killers. But killers with purpose. Killers with cause. Killers who understood they were trading their futures for their father's vindication and accepted that trade without hesitation or regret. On the evening of May 10th, after the funeral, the 4 Thompson brothers met in the barn on the family property. Michael had brought topographic maps of Pike County he'd obtained from the county clerk's office 2 years earlier for a surveying job that never materialized. David had brought the family's 3 hunting rifles, the Remington 700 their father had taught them to shoot with, a Winchester Model 70 in 30-06, and a Savage 110 in 270. James had brought ammunition, boxes of it, enough for what they all knew was coming. Thomas had brought something else, a list, 8 names written in careful block letters on a piece of notebook paper. The 8 deputies who'd been present when their father died. Eugene Tackett, Carl Mason, Frank Mullins, James Rowland, David Keith, Robert Pauley, Michael Gibson, and Sheriff Clayton Wade himself. The list was organized not alphabetically but strategically. Tackett lived alone in a trailer on Route 80, easy to approach, minimal risk of collateral casualties. Mason lived with his wife and 3 kids, required more careful planning. The others fell somewhere between. The brothers spent 4 hours that night planning, not talking about whether this was right or justified or worth the consequences. That discussion had already happened in silence at their father's graveside. Now it was pure logistics. Who lived where, daily routines, shift schedules at the sheriff's office, vehicles they drove, routes they took, where they stopped for coffee, for lunch, for cigarettes. Michael had learned planning in Vietnam, breaking down complex operations into achievable steps. David contributed his methodical nature, thinking through failure points and contingencies. James provided the cold analytical framework, treating it like a problem to be solved rather than lives to be ended. Thomas, despite being youngest, knew the county better than any of them, knew which back roads connected to which hollers, where you could disappear if things went wrong. By midnight on May 10th, they had a plan, 3 phases over 9 days. Deputies first, in order of opportunity and isolation. Sheriff Wade last, when he'd understand exactly why this was happening and who was responsible. The first target was Eugene Tackett, 34 years old, divorced, living in a single-wide trailer on a piece of rental property 6 miles east of Pikeville. Tackett worked the evening shift, 4 in the afternoon to midnight, then usually stopped at the all-night diner on Route 119 for breakfast before heading home. His routine was consistent, predictable, fatal. On the night of May 11th, a Saturday, Michael and David positioned themselves in the tree line above the gravel road that led to Tackett's trailer. They'd arrived at 1 a.m, dressed in dark clothing, faces covered with charcoal to kill the shine. The temperature had dropped to 54 degrees. No moon. Fog rolling down from the ridges. Perfect conditions. They waited 2 hours. At 3:17 in the morning, they heard Tackett's cruiser grinding up the gravel road, headlights cutting through fog. The brothers let him pass, counting to 30. Then Michael stepped into the road behind the cruiser and fired twice. Both rounds punched through the rear window and struck Tackett in the back of the head. The cruiser rolled forward maybe 20 feet before hitting a drainage ditch and stopping. Michael and David approached carefully, weapons ready, but Tackett was already dead. Brain matter on the dashboard. No movement. They didn't search the body or take anything. This wasn't robbery. It was execution. They disappeared into the woods, following a deer trail they'd memorized in daylight, reaching Michael's truck parked 2 miles away on an abandoned logging road. By 4:30 in the morning, they were back at the Thompson homestead. Tackett's body wasn't discovered until 7:15, when a neighbor noticed the cruiser in the ditch and investigated. Pike County Sheriff's Office received the call at 7:23. State police were notified at 7:41. By 9 in the morning, every law enforcement agency in eastern Kentucky knew that one of Sheriff Wade's deputies had been murdered. But knowing and proving were different things. The Thompson brothers had left no evidence, no witnesses, no trail except 2 empty shell casings that could have come from any .30-06 rifle in a county where everyone owned at least one. The second and third eliminations happened within 18 hours. Robert Pauley, 41 years old, married with 2 teenage daughters, lived on a farm outside Pikeville. He raised tobacco, kept some cattle, worked part-time for Wade's department when they needed extra bodies for raids or crowd control. Pauley wasn't a career criminal like some of Wade's inner circle. He was a man trying to make ends meet who'd made the catastrophic mistake of participating in Robert Thompson's murder. On the morning of May 12th, Pauley was feeding cattle in a pasture 400 yards from his house. James Thompson was positioned in the woods at the pasture's edge with the Winchester Model 70, single shot at 230 yards. Pauley dropped without knowing what hit him. His wife found him 40 minutes later and assumed heart attack until she saw the wound. David Keith, 36 years old, was eliminated that same evening. Keith lived in town, worked full-time for the sheriff's office, and was known for his enthusiasm during raids. He liked the power that came with a badge, liked making people afraid. On May 12th at 9:30 in the evening, Keith left his house to drive to the Dairy Queen on Main Street, a routine he followed 3 times a week. He never arrived. Thomas Thompson had been waiting in the parking lot of the abandoned gas station across from Keith's house. When Keith's personal vehicle, a 1972 Ford pickup, drove past, Thomas followed at a distance with headlights off. 2 miles out of town, on a straight stretch of Route 80 where Keith always accelerated, Thomas pulled alongside and David, riding passenger, fired 3 rounds through Keith's window. The truck veered off the road, hit an embankment, and flipped twice. Keith died from the gunshot wounds, not the crash. The truck burned, destroying most physical evidence. By May 13th, 3 deputies were dead and Pike County was in a state of panic. Sheriff Wade requested assistance from Kentucky State Police, who sent 20 troopers to help secure the county. FBI field office in Louisville was notified and sent 2 agents to observe. But the Thompson brothers had grown up in these mountains. They knew every hollow, every abandoned mine entrance, every logging road that didn't appear on any map. Law enforcement was searching 789 square miles of wilderness for 4 men who understood the terrain better than anyone. On May 13th, James Rowland, 39 years old, was killed while checking his mailbox at the end of his driveway. Michael Thompson from 300 yards with the Remington 700, single headshot. Rowland's wife watched it happen from the kitchen window and couldn't even describe what she'd seen because the shooter was invisible in the tree line. and the sound of the gunshot echoed so strangely off the mountains, she and spaded, couldn't tell which direction it came from. On May 14th, Frank Mullins, 43 years old, was eliminated while pumping gas at the Exxon station on Route 119. David Thompson walked up behind him, fired twice at point-blank range, and disappeared into the crowd of panicked customers before anyone could react. Security cameras captured grainy footage of a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses, but nothing that could lead to identification. By May 14th at 6 p.m, 5 of 8 deputies were dead. The FBI had established a command post in Pikeville. State police had roadblocks on every major route out of the county. News media from as far as Lexington and Charleston were descending on Pike County to cover what they were calling the worst mass killing of law enforcement officers in Kentucky history. But the Thompson brothers weren't trying to escape. They were living in plain sight at the family homestead, mourning their father during the day, planning the next elimination each night. No one suspected them because revenge killings were supposed to be passionate, immediate, sloppy. This was methodical, patient, professional, the work of someone with military training and absolute commitment. Sheriff Clayton Wade, watching his department systematically destroyed, finally understood on May 14th who was responsible and why. He called a meeting with his 3 surviving deputies, Carl Mason, Michael Gibson, and Thomas Dalton, at his home on Lake Cumberland. They couldn't stay in Pike County. The Thompsons were hunting them and clearly had no intention of stopping until the entire department was eliminated. Wade proposed they barricade themselves in the Pike County Courthouse, request National Guard protection, and wait for the Thompsons to make a mistake. It was the decision of a desperate man who'd finally realized that corruption had consequences, and those consequences were coming for him with rifles and cold determination. On the morning of May 15th, Sheriff Clayton Wade and his 3 remaining deputies, Carl Mason, Michael Gibson, and Thomas Dalton, moved into the Pike County Courthouse. They brought food, water, ammunition, and the understanding that they were no longer hunters but prey. The courthouse was a solid limestone building with thick walls and limited entry points. Second-floor windows offered good sightlines on the surrounding streets. It was defensible, assuming the attackers didn't have overwhelming force or unlimited time. The Thompsons had both. Kentucky State Police had established a perimeter around downtown Pikeville, but they were protecting a sheriff's department that half the county knew was corrupt. Troopers went through the motions, but their hearts weren't in protecting men who'd murdered a civilian in his own home and called it law enforcement. By noon on May 15th, the situation had evolved into a standoff. Wade and his deputies inside the courthouse, the Thompson brothers somewhere in Pike County, and everyone else waiting to see how it would end. The siege lasted 21 hours. During that time, the Thompson brothers moved through Pikeville like ghosts. Michael positioned himself in the bell tower of the Baptist church with a clear line of sight to the courthouse. David took a position in the abandoned coal company office across Main Street. James and Thomas maintained mobility, moving between locations, creating the impression of a larger force than 4 men. They didn't shoot randomly or recklessly. They waited. At 4:30 in the afternoon on May 15th, Michael Gibson made the fatal mistake of showing himself in a second-floor window. Michael Thompson's shot from 400 yards away shattered the window and struck Gibson in the chest. He died within minutes, despite Carl Mason's attempts at first aid, 3 deputies remaining. At 7:45 that evening, Thomas Dalton attempted to move from the second floor to the first floor, thinking the interior stairs were safe from sniper fire. James Thompson had anticipated this. He'd positioned himself in a building across the alley, with an angle on the courthouse's interior through a ground-floor window. One shot through the open courthouse door. Dalton fell on the stairs and bled out while Wade and Mason listened to him die, unable to reach him without exposing themselves. 2 deputies remaining, Sheriff Wade and Carl Mason. By midnight on May 15th, the courthouse was dark. Power had been cut, whether by the Thompsons or by state police trying to force a resolution wasn't clear. Wade and Mason sat in Wade's second-floor office, armed with shotguns and service revolvers, knowing that sunrise would bring a reckoning they couldn't avoid. At 2:30 in the morning on May 16th, the Thompson brothers made their move. Not a frontal assault, not a siege, but a simple statement of purpose. They set fire to Wade's Cadillac, parked behind the courthouse. Then they set fire to Mason's truck parked on Main Street. Then they set fire to the abandoned building next to the courthouse. The message was clear. You can hide for a while, but eventually you'll have to come out, and when you do, we'll be waiting. At 4:15 in the morning, with 3 fires burning and firefighters afraid to approach because of the active shooter situation, Sheriff Clayton Wade made a decision. He wasn't going to die trapped in this building. He was going to walk out and face whatever came. Wade and Mason emerged from the courthouse at 4:33 in the morning, hands visible, weapons holstered. State police immediately surrounded them, creating a protective barrier, hustling them toward armored vehicles that had been brought in overnight. The Thompson brothers could have taken the shot. Michael had a clear angle from the church tower, but they didn't shoot. This wasn't about killing Wade and Mason in a quick execution. This was about making them live with what they'd done, making them face trial, making the whole corrupt system be exposed in court. The brothers wanted justice, not just revenge. They wanted their father's name cleared and Wade's crimes revealed. At 5:42 in the morning, on May 16th, Kentucky State Police SWAT team surrounded the Thompson homestead. Helicopters circled overhead. Troopers with bullhorns called for the brothers to surrender. Inside the house, Michael, David, James, and Thomas Thompson sat at the kitchen table, where their father had drunk coffee every morning for 40 years. They were out of ammunition, out of time, out of options, but they'd accomplished what they'd set out to do. 8 men who'd participated in their father's murder were dead. 2 more were in custody and would face questions they couldn't answer. Michael Thompson walked onto the porch first, hands raised. David followed, then James, then Thomas. They knelt in the dirt where their mother's flower garden used to grow before grief had killed her interest in beauty. State police swarmed them, cuffed them, searched them, and found nothing except the weight of what they'd done and the certainty that they'd do it again given the same circumstances. The siege of Pike County was over. 11 law enforcement officers dead in 9 days, 4 brothers in custody, and a county forced to confront the reality that sometimes monsters wear badges and sometimes killers believe they're dispensing justice. The line between the two had never been thinner. The arrest of the Thompson brothers on May 16, 1974, happened without violence. They surrendered peacefully at 5:58 in the morning, kneeling in the dirt yard, while 73 Kentucky State Police troopers, 26 FBI agents, and 14 National Guard members secured a property that posed no threat. The brothers were separated immediately, placed in different vehicles, transported to different facilities. Standard procedure for co-conspirators, designed to prevent coordination of stories and encourage confession. But the Thompson brothers had nothing to hide and no intention of denying what they'd done. They'd eliminated 8 men who'd murdered their father. They'd terrorized 2 others into surrender. And they'd forced Pike County to confront corruption that everyone had known about but no one had challenged. Michael Thompson was taken to the Kentucky State Police Barracks in Harlan County. David went to the federal holding facility in Lexington. James was transported to the Letcher County Jail. Thomas, being youngest, was held separately at a juvenile facility in Prestonsburg, despite being 22 years old. The separation was strategic. Interrogators wanted each brother isolated, vulnerable, willing to provide evidence against the others in exchange for reduced sentences. The interrogations began within hours of arrest. FBI Special Agent Raymond Cross questioned Michael Thompson for 6 hours straight. Cross was 48 years old, 22 years with the Bureau, specializing in domestic terrorism and organized violence. He'd interviewed bank robbers, bombers, kidnappers, and murderers. But Michael Thompson was different. He showed no remorse, no fear, no interest in negotiating. Cross asked why they'd done it. Michael's response was 4 words: "They killed our father." Cross asked if Michael understood that 11 law enforcement officers were dead. Michael corrected him. 8. The other 3 were suicide by conscience, choosing to die rather than surrender. Cross asked if Michael felt any guilt. Michael's response was to ask if Cross had ever watched his father bleed out on a hallway floor while corrupt deputies planted evidence to justify murder. The interrogation ended when Michael invoked his right to an attorney and stopped speaking entirely. Similar scenes played out with David, James, and Thomas. None of them denied involvement. None of them provided details that could incriminate their brothers. None of them showed any regret for what they'd done. By May 18th, the Pike County Prosecutor's Office faced an impossible situation. 11 dead law enforcement officers demanded justice, but charging the Thompson brothers required acknowledging why the killings had happened, and that meant exposing Sheriff Clayton Wade's corruption, examining the circumstances of Robert Thompson's death, and potentially admitting that the entire sheriff's department had been operating as a criminal enterprise for over 2 decades. The prosecutor, Lawrence Mitchell, 56 years old and elected to his position with Wade's support, understood that this case would define his career and possibly end it. He could charge the Thompsons with capital murder and seek the death penalty, which is what law enforcement agencies across Kentucky were demanding. Or he could investigate Robert Thompson's death honestly and risk revealing systemic corruption that implicated not just Wade but county commissioners, judges, and other officials who'd enabled the protection racket. Mitchell chose politics over truth. On May 21st, he announced that Michael, David, James, and Thomas Thompson would be charged with 11 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and domestic terrorism. All capital offenses. Death penalty recommended. The announcement triggered immediate backlash. Civil rights organizations pointed out that Robert Thompson had been killed in a questionable raid, and his death had never been properly investigated. Defense attorneys argued that the brothers had been driven to extreme action by systemic failure of legal institutions meant to protect them, and residents of Pike County, who'd lived under Wade's corruption for decades, began speaking publicly for the first time about payoffs, protection rackets, and selective enforcement that had turned the sheriff's department into an organized criminal enterprise. The Kentucky Attorney General's office, responding to public pressure and media scrutiny, announced on May 25th that it would conduct an independent investigation into the Pike County Sheriff's Department and the circumstances surrounding Robert Thompson's death. The investigation would be led by Special Prosecutor Ann Catherine Morris, 41 years old, known for her aggressive prosecution of public corruption cases. Morris had no political ties to Pike County, no relationships with Wade or his network, and a reputation for following evidence wherever it led, regardless of political consequences. The trial of the Thompson brothers began on August 12, 1974, in Frankfort, Kentucky. Venue had been changed from Pike County due to pretrial publicity and the impossibility of finding an impartial jury in a county where everyone had an opinion about Wade's corruption and Robert Thompson's death. The prosecution was led by Lawrence Mitchell and 2 assistant prosecutors from Pike County. The defense team consisted of 4 attorneys from the Kentucky Civil Liberties Union who'd taken the case pro bono, recognizing its significance for questions about citizen response to government corruption. Judge Harold Patterson, 63 years old, known for his strict adherence to procedure and his intolerance for grandstanding, presided over a courtroom packed with media, law enforcement representatives, and members of both the Thompson and Wade families. The trial would last 3 months. Over 100 witnesses would testify, and the question before the jury wasn't simply whether the Thompson brothers had killed 11 men. That was undisputed. The question was whether systemic corruption and the murder of their father constituted sufficient provocation to reduce charges from capital murder to voluntary manslaughter. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Between May 11th and May 15th, 1974, the Thompson brothers had systematically hunted and killed 8 Pike County Sheriff's deputies and caused the deaths of 3 others during a siege of the county courthouse. The killings were premeditated, planned, and executed with military precision. The brothers had shown no mercy, no hesitation, and no remorse. They had terrorized an entire county, forced businesses to close, schools to shut down, and created a climate of fear that traumatized thousands of innocent residents. The fact that they believed their actions were justified did not make them legal. Vigilante justice was still murder, and murder, regardless of motive, demanded the ultimate punishment. The prosecution called family members of the dead deputies, wives who described hearing the news that their husbands had been killed, children who would grow up without fathers, colleagues who described the fear of knowing they were being hunted. Each testimony was designed to humanize the victims and demonstrate the devastating impact of the Thompson brothers' actions. The defense strategy was more complex. They didn't deny the killings. Instead, they argued that the Thompson brothers had been driven to extreme action by the complete failure of legal institutions meant to protect them. They presented evidence of Wade's corruption, financial records showing unexplained deposits totaling over $300,000 in the past 5 years, testimony from marijuana growers who paid protection money, documents proving that Robert Thompson's death had been ruled justified without proper investigation. The defense called Martha Thompson to testify. She described watching her husband executed in their hallway. She described how deputies had never found any illegal weapons, despite tearing the house apart. She described calling the sheriff's office to report threatening phone calls and shots fired at their home and receiving no response. She described her sons as good men driven to desperate action by a corrupt system that had murdered their father and would face no consequences. The defense called Special Prosecutor Ann Morris, who testified about her investigation into the Pike County Sheriff's Department. Morris presented evidence that Wade had been operating a protection racket since at least 1968, that deputies routinely collected payoffs from marijuana growers, that the department had covered up multiple instances of excessive force and illegal searches. Most damaging to the prosecution's case, Morris presented the autopsy report on Robert Thompson. Dr. William Patterson, the medical examiner, testified that wound patterns indicated Robert had been standing still when shot, not reaching for a weapon, that the official report had been sanitized under pressure from law enforcement, that in his professional opinion, Robert Thompson's death was an execution, not a justified use of force. The testimony created reasonable doubt not about whether the Thompson brothers had killed 11 men, but about whether those killings constituted murder or a desperate response to murder committed by the state itself. The jury heard 3 months of testimony. They heard about corruption, about betrayal of public trust, about a father killed in his own home. They also heard about 8 men shot from distance without warning, about 3 others who died during a siege, about a county terrorized by 4 brothers who'd appointed themselves judge, jury, and executioner. On November 8, 1974, the jury began deliberations. They would deliberate for 6 days. On November 14, 1974, after 6 days of deliberation and multiple requests to review testimony, the jury returned with a verdict that satisfied no one and reflected the impossible moral complexity of the case. The Thompson brothers were found guilty of voluntary manslaughter on all 11 counts. Not capital murder, not first-degree murder, but manslaughter. The jury had concluded that while the killings were intentional and premeditated, they had been committed under extreme emotional disturbance caused by their father's murder and the complete failure of legal institutions to provide justice. The verdict meant the brothers would face prison time but not execution. Sentencing occurred on December 3, 1974. Judge Patterson sentenced each brother to life imprisonment with possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentences would run concurrently. In pronouncing sentence, Patterson acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had driven 4 otherwise law-abiding men to violence. but he emphasized that private citizens could not be allowed to wage war against law enforcement regardless of provocation. The rule of law had to mean something even when those enforcing the law had become criminals themselves. The trial's aftermath rippled through Kentucky's legal and political establishment. Special Prosecutor Ann Morris's investigation led to indictments of Sheriff Clayton Wade on 43 counts, including racketeering, extortion, corruption, and conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Robert Thompson. Carl Mason, Wade's chief deputy, was indicted on 37 counts. Both men were convicted in separate trials in 1975 and sentenced to federal prison. Wade received 40 years. Mason received 30. The Pike County Sheriff's Department was dissolved by order of the Kentucky Attorney General. A special master was appointed to oversee reorganization and implement reforms. Every deputy was required to resign and reapply for their position with enhanced background checks and integrity screening. Only 2 of the original department's 23 employees were rehired. The corruption investigation expanded beyond Pike County as evidence emerged of similar protection rackets in neighboring counties. By 1976, 8 more sheriffs had been indicted across eastern Kentucky. The Thompson case became the catalyst for the most significant law enforcement reform in Kentucky history. But reform didn't return Robert Thompson to life. It didn't restore the years his sons would spend in prison. It didn't heal Martha Thompson, who survived her husband by only 3 years, dying of heart failure in 1977 at age 55, broken by grief and the knowledge that her sons would spend their lives in cages. Michael Thompson served his sentence at Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville. He became a model prisoner, worked in the prison library, earned a degree through correspondence courses. He was stabbed in 1982 by another inmate whose brother had been a deputy in Pike County. He survived, but lost function in his left hand. He died of lung cancer in 2006 at age 61, having served 32 years. He never applied for parole, believing that accepting freedom would somehow diminish what they'd done or suggest it had been wrong. David Thompson was incarcerated at Luther Luckett Correctional Complex. He taught himself law, became a jailhouse lawyer helping other inmates with appeals and civil rights claims. He applied for parole in 1999 after 25 years and was denied. Applied again in 2004 and was denied again. He died of a heart attack in 2011 at age 64, having served 37 years. James Thompson served his time at Eastern Kentucky Correctional Complex. He completed a master's degree in history through prison education programs, wrote extensively about Appalachian culture and the intersection of poverty and crime. His writings were published in academic journals under a pseudonym. He applied for parole in 2001 and was granted release in 2002 at age 52. He lived quietly in Lexington, working at a homeless shelter, until his death from complications of diabetes in 2019 at age 69. Thomas Thompson, the youngest, was incarcerated at North Point Training Center. He struggled more than his brothers with imprisonment, spent time in solitary confinement for fighting, battled depression and substance abuse within the prison system. He was granted parole in 2008 at age 56, after 34 years. He returned to Pike County, found work at a sawmill, lived alone in a small apartment in Pikeville. As of 2024, at age 72, he remains the only surviving Thompson brother. He refuses interviews, refuses to discuss the events of May 1974, and lives with the weight of choices made 50 years ago when justice seemed impossible and revenge seemed inevitable. 50 years have passed since that May in 1974, when 4 brothers declared war on a corrupt sheriff's department and 11 men died in 9 days. The Thompson homestead was sold by the county in 1978 after Martha Thompson's death and years of unpaid property taxes. The 47 acres that Robert Thompson had died defending were purchased by a development company in 1983, subdivided, and sold off in parcels. Today, 6 houses sit on land that 4 generations of Thompsons had farmed. The families who live there know nothing of the blood that soaked into that soil or the principle that made it worth dying for. The white farmhouse where Robert was killed was torn down in 1985. A modern split-level ranch sits in its place. Children play in the yard where Martha Thompson's flower garden once grew. They know nothing of the morning when state police surrounded their property, or the brothers who knelt in the dirt and traded their freedom for their father's honor. Pike County has changed in the decades since the Thompson vendetta, though not as much as reformers hoped. Population has declined to under 58,000 as young people leave for opportunities that don't exist in coal country. Unemployment remains high. Opioid addiction has replaced marijuana as the primary drug crisis. The corruption that Wade represented didn't disappear. It evolved, adapted, found new forms. Every few years, another sheriff or county official gets indicted for misuse of funds or protection of criminal enterprises. The systems that failed Robert Thompson continue to fail residents of rural Kentucky, just in different ways. But the Thompson case did create lasting change. It established legal precedent that extreme provocation and systemic failure of justice can mitigate even the most serious crimes. It led to oversight mechanisms that make sheriff departments accountable to state authorities. And it forced Kentucky to confront the reality that poverty and isolation create conditions where corruption thrives, and desperate people make choices they'd never consider under different circumstances. There is no memorial in Pike County to the 11 dead law enforcement officers. No plaque, no monument, no annual ceremony. Their deaths remain controversial, some viewing them as fallen heroes, others as corrupt deputies who got what they deserved. There is no memorial to Robert Thompson either. No marker on his grave explaining why he died or what his death set in motion. Just a simple headstone with dates and the words beloved husband and father. The Thompson brothers' story has no heroes. It has a father who refused to compromise his principles and paid with his life. It has 4 sons who loved their father more than their own futures and chose revenge over survival. It has 8 deputies who participated in a corrupt system and died for it. It has a sheriff who built an empire on extortion and spent his final years in federal prison, dying there in 1993 at age 71, unrepentant to the end. The story has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned Appalachia, leaving people with no legal way to survive, law enforcement that became the criminal enterprise it was supposed to fight, courts that protected the powerful and ignored the powerless, and a culture of silence that allowed corruption to flourish because speaking truth carried consequences nobody could afford. Were the Thompson brothers murderers? Yes. They eliminated 11 men with premeditation and planning. They terrorized a county, destroyed families, and crossed boundaries that no civilized society can permit its citizens to cross. Were they also desperate sons driven to extremes by the murder of their father and the complete failure of justice? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is, both things can be true simultaneously. And that is the most disturbing aspect of this story because it forces us to ask questions we would rather avoid. What would we do if someone murdered our father and the legal system protected the killers? How far would we go to defend what our family had held sacred for generations? Does justice exist when the law itself has become criminal? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence? Or does extreme corruption erase that line entirely, leaving only blood and justifications that sound hollow in courtrooms but made perfect sense in the moment? The Thompson brothers crossed a boundary that no human being should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where a sheriff's department could execute a man in his own home and face no consequences, where corruption was so entrenched that legal channels offered no possibility of justice, where 4 sons watched their father's murderers walk free and understood that they were alone in a system designed to protect power rather than people. There is no easy answer here, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion where good triumphs and evil is punished, just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds violence. Broken systems create desperate people, and sometimes the line between justice and vengeance becomes so thin it disappears entirely, leaving only corpses and questions and families destroyed on both sides. 50 years have passed since that May in the Cumberland Mountains. Rural America has not healed. It has evolved, adapted, found new ways to struggle, and new ways to fail the people who live in forgotten counties. Every year, families face impossible choices when systems abandon them. Every year, some turn to violence. The specific circumstances change, the weapons, the justifications, but the underlying truth remains. Push people far enough, take away their father, their land, their dignity, and some will push back in ways that shock us precisely because they mirror our own capacity for darkness when everything else has been taken away. The Thompson property is gone now, divided and developed beyond recognition. The courthouse where 3 deputies died still stands, renovated in 2008, its bullet scars repaired and painted over. Pike County continues, diminished but persistent, like all of Appalachia, and somewhere in Pikeville, Thomas Thompson, 72 years old, the last survivor of 4 brothers who chose honor over freedom, lives quietly with memories of a father who taught him that some things mattered more than life itself, and the knowledge that he proved that principle at a cost that can never be repaid. If this story made you think about justice, corruption, and the price we pay when systems fail and desperate people take law into their own hands, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about law and morality, about how far ordinary people will go when institutions meant to protect them become the threat they must defend against. Comment below. What would you have done in the Thompson brothers' position? Where do you draw the line between protecting your family's honor and becoming a killer? Because these stories are not just history. They are happening right now somewhere in forgotten counties, where the system has failed and desperation takes hold and ordinary people make choices they can never take back. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear are not always born that way. Sometimes they are made. One corrupt sheriff, one murdered father, one impossible choice at a time. And the line between justice and vengeance is drawn not in law books, but in the human heart, where it has always been thinnest, always been easiest to cross, always been hardest to find our way back from.